Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome, everyone, to part 4 of channeling. Also, today is a special day, Lag BaOmer, which we will talk about in a few moments as part of the discussion today. Before we start, I want to just dedicate the shir to the neshama of Ruth Bat Abraham, Rita's mother, which is Yortzeit, is this Shabbos, I think. Neshama should have an aliyah, be elevated, and tremendous long life and bracha for the whole family. So we are working on emotions which we normally consider negative, but we're working with a philosophy that everything has a positive and everything has a purpose, and therefore can be channeled into a positive way and a positive expression. So just a bit of review from last week. Last week we talked about jealousy, and we explained that the prohibition or the destructiveness of jealous feelings actually is based in the Ten Commandments. Talked about the two different expressions, lo tachbod, which is not to actually do something about getting things of other people, but even lo titaveh, which means not even to have the feelings. So the Torah actually guides us that even the feelings of jealousy, the Torah says, are negative, and not just as negative, but is very clear about this concept that we are in control, and therefore we can go through a process where we apply and we work on certain strategies to make sure that we even minimize, at least, or get rid of the feelings, the destructive, the negative feelings of being jealous of other people. So we discussed just a few strategies to deal with the negative part of jealousy, which was, number one, was the idea of faith, really believing that what is ours, what is ours is meant to be ours, what is not ours was never meant to come to us, and therefore it has no connection to us, and so on. We talked about the concept of how we perceive ourselves, the self-esteem, how we define ourselves. Are we defining ourselves by image, or are we defining ourselves by intrinsic value, which should minimize the need or the wish to have what others have? We talked about the idea of kol asher le'recha, when the Torah says don't be jealous of everything of the other person. In other words, if you want to be jealous of the other person, you might want to become like the other person completely, which is problematic because you don't know. You only see the things that they seem to be enjoying. You don't know what's part of their life and what's part of their journey, and you don't want their, as we say in Yiddish, you don't want necessarily their pekel because everyone's got one. And therefore, one of their strategies is to be focusing on the things that are good. In other words, focusing on our blessings rather than things that we don't have. And then finally, we talked about a strategy of investing in other people. In other words, when we invest in people, then we become like what the rabbis tell us, that we're not jealous of people that are close to us, like children and students. So therefore, the more we invest and connect to other people, the less we become jealous with them. Then we talked about the concept of channeling. So positive jealousy. In positive jealousy, we talked about this idea of wanting to grow, using other people as a form of modeling rather than being jealous. In other words, aspiring and being jealous of other people's values and learning and knowledge and good personalities, so that we should want to emulate that and copy that. And we talked about three things that would determine if our jealousy is good or bad. Number one, it would be rather not being based on external pleasure, but rather being based on values. The idea that jealousy is about not only about what we want to have, but what others shouldn't have. And the idea of fargining, which means to be happy and to allow other people to have, but just want to be like them as well on a value-based system. And thirdly, the idea of being able to have boundaries. And even if we want certain things, even good things that we want to emulate or model ourselves, but we don't always have the ability to be like that, and we have to know when we need to just stop and say, it'd be good to be like that, but it's not for me, or I can't do it now, or whatever the case is. So those are the three things. If those three things are there, and in fact, jealousy, we talked about the second Pesach, that idea of wanting to grow, wanting to have extra spirituality in our lives, extra value, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, what I want to do today, obviously we're going to continue on with this topic, and we're going to pick another emotion or mindset that we want to look at the negative part of it, but also know how to channel it. But I want to just do something a little bit different, because today is Lag BaOmer. So Lag BaOmer is an extremely special day. For those who are not familiar, especially Kabbalistically and spiritually. Lag BaOmer is considered one of the big days of the year. It has many reasons, but the primary sort of reason why it's considered such a powerful day, just to explain, because today is the Yortzeit, today is the day of passing of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that's his place of burial on the day of Lag BaOmer. There's actually a live stream, this is probably for a different year, but you could actually go on a live stream, you'd see something like this. So what happens on Lag BaOmer is literally hundreds of thousands of people converge at his graveside in Meiron, just about 10-15 minute drive from Tzfat. The reason they do that is the following. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was he lived in about the 1st century, 2nd century, 1st century. He was a tremendous, besides being a Talmudic scholar in the legal sense, he was an amazing mystic and a Kabbalist, and in fact he authored when I say authored, he didn't publish at the time, but he authored the seminal work of Kabbalah known as the Zohar. That was his teachings, that was his work. And he was an incredibly spiritual, mystical man. He spent 12 years with his son in a cave, 13 years actually in total, hiding from the Romans when they were running after him in persecution for studying Torah and so on. And when he was in the cave, he even elevated himself to even a greater spiritual height. And before he passed away, just to give you a bit of context, before he passed away, he called together his closest students on the day of Lag BaOmer. He had an amazing passing, by the way. He called together his students and he said to them that he knows that this is it, his time is up. He has completed his perfect mission in this world. He said to his students that he felt that his neshama, his soul, and his being, therefore, had reached the ultimate connection and bond with God. And he called them around and he said, I'm going to reveal to you things today that I've never revealed before. And what he revealed that day became a part of the Zohar. And he started talking, he instructed one of them to listen, one of them to write, and so on. And a bright light surrounded the house. And he continued to talk, and there was this bright light around his bed, actually, that the students found it very difficult to look at. And so they looked down and they heard him talking. And as he was talking, he quoted a verse. Just want to give you the background, so it's just interesting. And he quoted a verse, and the verse had the word life in it, Chaim, the word Chaim. And when he said the word Chaim, he stopped and didn't continue talking. And they were wondering what's happening, and eventually someone looked up and they saw that he'd actually passed away, and he had a smile on his face. That was his passing. That's little Lag BaOmer. Now, why am I telling you this? Because before he passed away, he said, he requested, I should say, that the day of his passing, being that this was the day he reached the ultimate height of spiritual connection, and he said that every year this would happen again. In other words, every year the energy, the power of his Yortzeit would be one where his neshama would once again connect that way and would be able to infuse the world with a tremendous, powerful energy. He asked that everyone should join in on Lag BaOmer into what he called his celebration. Yom Simchat Libo, the day of his celebration. And ever since then, Lag BaOmer became, rather than a Yortzeit being something that sort of obviously is sad because we missed the person, but nevertheless, in his case, particularly in Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's case, and by extension, we understand that there's that positive every year on a person's Yortzeit where the neshama once again is able to be elevated and affects people down here and so on. So it became a very big day of celebration, particularly with people who are more connected to the study of Kabbalah. And as a result, in Israel, literally for 24 hours, there are hundreds and thousands of people there who dance and sing, and like the dancers, there are white bonfires and so on and so forth. So why am I mentioning that? Because in the context of our discussion, I wanted to do two things. I wanted to, first of all, just take one of the lessons from Lag BaOmer and apply it to the discussion we've been having on a general level, and then look at another channeling process that we need to understand based on one of his teachings in the Ethics of the Fathers. So I thought it would be nice to learn something from him today in the context of our topic in honor of Lag BaOmer. So, one of the customs of Lag BaOmer, well-known customs, particularly with children, is to take children outside into the field, into the open space on Lag BaOmer, and to play bow and arrow. That was, right? That's the custom. Obviously, it's got to be safe, and right. You can get it in the toy store. A toy archery one is also good. Doesn't have an arrow at the end. You can. Okay. Now, why did this custom come about? So, on a very simple historic level, the background to the custom is as follows: that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai lived with his teacher. He was a disciple of Rabbi Akiva, by the way. So, they lived in a terrible time. They lived under tremendous persecution from the Roman regime. And one of the things that the Romans prohibited during that era was the study of Torah. Cleverly so. The Romans realized, it took them a while to realize this actually, but they realized that the secret to the Jewish nation's survival is not going to be the temple, because they realized that after they destroyed the temple, as disastrous and catastrophic as that was, the Jewish people kept on thriving. And they realized that the secret was, because although they didn't have a temple, which was the headquarters of Jewish activity, yet they were able to continue setting up academies of learning and passing on the knowledge, because critical to Jewish survival, or to use a modern buzz phrase, Jewish continuity, is Jewish education. That's absolutely clear and been proven throughout history, time and time again. So they decided, well, that's the only way to get rid of them. So we're going to have to prohibit, under very strict and harsh conditions, Jewish learning. That's the only way to do it, right? Which they did, from kids, adults, everything. But that didn't stop us, as it never does. So they set up with their students ways of going into forests and hiding in caves and continuing to study and to learn. And what they would do is they would put people outside in the fields just to watch in case there were Roman patrols coming and checking, right? So what they would do is, when they were going to the thing, and when they were out in the open and there was under the eye of Roman soldiers, they would play bow and arrow, the kids. Because that was like a sport in those times. So therefore, that was like as if to say, we're just having a good time. And as a result, that's one of the customs, like Omer, to go out and play with bow and arrow. That's one reason. Second reason that's brought is because actually, in Hebrew, the word for bow and arrow, the bow is keshet, right? Keshet is the same word as a rainbow. Now the Talmud tells us that during the lifetime of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, there was no rainbow. Why? Because a rainbow, no, there was rain, just there was no rainbow. There was no visible rainbow. There was plenty of rain, actually. A rainbow is, I don't know if you know this, a rainbow is not such a good sign always. It's not considered such a wonderful sign. The reason is because after the flood, it says in the Chumash that God structured this concept of a rainbow, the nature would work in such a way. Because the sign that God promised after he destroyed the world with the flood, that he wouldn't destroy the world again, was the rainbow. In other words, the rainbow is almost like, I'm not so happy with some of you guys, I would like to maybe bring another flood, but I promised I wouldn't, so therefore, here's the rainbow, right? Therefore, there's all kinds of customs behind that, by the way. There's a concept, we make a blessing when we see a rainbow, but there's an idea of not telling someone you've seen a rainbow. Like, you've got to notice it yourself. It's like some people have a custom, like if they see a rainbow, and they see other people around them haven't noticed it, they don't say, oh, look, there's a rainbow there. As beautiful as it is, but they don't point it out. Okay. So that's two of the reasons why people play with bow and arrow. However, every Jewish custom has multi-layers. So what I really wanted to get to is to share with you the mystical reason of why there's a custom to play with a bow and arrow on Lag BaOmer. The reason I'm sharing with you this mystical reason is because it's relevant to the discussion that we've been having in terms of how we channel something positively rather than expressing it in a negative way. And this is brought down in various commentaries that explain Jewish practice and Jewish custom by way of mystical sort of understanding, because we have a principle that Jewish customs never just happen. If they happen, there's a meaning, there's a purpose, there's a deeper meaning behind them, Kabbalistic meaning behind them. Right? So one of the explanations goes like this. In ancient times, the common weapon was a sword. And sometimes people would use bows and arrows. What's the difference between an arrow and a sword? So a sword is for close combat. Right? A sword is someone you kill someone who's an enemy that's close. You see someone and it's face-to-face combat. Right? An arrow, or bow and arrow, to shoot an arrow is to shoot at an enemy which you don't see, an enemy that's not obvious, an enemy that's far away. Right? So in ancient times, that was also a form of warfare. If they wanted to shoot far, they would use arrows. Right? presumably with bows and arrows, so they could get it to go quickly, to go a further distance. So that's the one concept. The other thing with the bow and arrow is that the way you use a bow and arrow, in a negative sense, in a destructive sense, in a weaponry sense, is in order to shoot the arrow very far, you have to pull it towards you first. The closer you pull it towards you, the further it's going to be. Okay. So the mystics explain the following idea. When we talk about weaponry, again, everything has a purpose in the world. Weaponry is a destructive thing normally. Weaponry is a negative thing, or has a negative image. But weaponry in the physical sense, even when it's destructive and negative, represents weaponry in the spiritual sense. Right? We are created to struggle. We've said this many, many times. We are created to fight a war. To fight the war against the negative forces that are within us that stand in the way of our personal growth, of our spiritual progress, and so on. So, when we fight our own internal war, right, there's also two wars that we have to fight. Number one, we have to fight the war against the obvious enemy, and we have to fight the war against the hidden enemy. So the obvious enemy are the things that are obvious. When we have a feeling of jealousy, or when we have a feeling of hate, which is negative, that's an obvious enemy. Those are enemies which are conscious, which we know they're wrong. When we lose our temper, when we throw a tantrum, we know it was wrong, we know it was a problem. We're not always able to overcome it, and part of our mission is to fight that war. So we're fighting a war against that which is obvious. That's like the sword. Right? So we try to get rid of it. We try to stop getting angry. We try to stop feeling jealous. We start to stop hating. We try to forgive. We don't take revenge, and so on and so forth. However, in order to do that, as we've been talking about, we need to fight a hidden enemy, which is much more subtle, much less obvious, much more distant in the symbolic sense. Not distant, it's actually it's very present and very dangerous, but it's distant in the symbolic sense where we don't notice it, and that's the subtle ego. Right? The subtle ego that sometimes takes us off the proper path. Right? Now the Talmud is full of this concepts that we all have. Sometimes we have a full-blown ego, but sometimes it's the ego that it's at the root of our negative reactions that are difficult, that are subtle and hard to notice, right? One of the examples, I'll give you two examples. One of the examples in the Talmud is, one of them is from a concept we've talked about many times, but also to do with Lag BaOmer, right? But Lag BaOmer also has to do with Rabbi Akiva. You know that during this time of the year, there's partial mourning, right? There's the time during this period between Pesach and Shavuot, different customs of exactly when you observe this, but there's the concept of not listening to music or not getting married and so on and so forth, right? Partial mourning. Why? Because we have a tradition that during this time, Rabbi Akiva, this is a staggering thing if you think about it in the numbers, but Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 students, and they all passed away within one period, between Pesach and Shavuot. Sometimes between Pesach and Shavuot. These were great sages, these were great Talmudists, these were great authorities in halacha and so on, and yet they were all punished very harshly. Why? With the acceptance of five. Subtle ego. Why? Because they were disrespectful to each other. And I've shared this with you before, but the commentaries explain, the commentaries ask the question, how could you possibly say that they were disrespectful to each other? After all, they were students of Rabbi Akiva, who was the chief teacher of the phrase, Ve'ahavta l're'acha kamocha, you shall love your fellow like yourself. He was the one who taught this a lot. He said this was the fundamental principle in the Torah, and so on and so forth. And the answer that's given, or one of the answers that's given, is that it was because of their love for each other, and because each one understood the teachings of their same teacher in a bit of a different way, right? Because that's what happens. They were all students of Rabbi Akiva, but people think differently, and even if you learn from the same teacher, they applied a bit differently, and therefore each one thought their way of understanding was absolutely correct, and out of their love for their fellow, they tried to impose and persuade and force other people to follow in the way they thought it should be applied, the result being disrespect, at least on their level. What did that come from? A very, very subtle, almost non-noticeable ego. In other words, sometimes we don't know, sometimes we think we out for the cause. We think we know this is the right thing to do, forgetting that perhaps it's a slight self-interest that is the distant enemy that's unnoticeable and completely out of the eye's view that can sometimes drive us to do things which are actually driven by self-interest, even though we talk ourselves into it, and we rationalize and we think that it's actually for the pure cause, and it's actually not. And we have to be very, very careful with that. Particularly when it comes to the topic that we're discussing, as I said last week. Particularly when it comes to this idea of channeling negative emotions. Yes, hate and revenge and jealousy have a place, but you always have to be careful that it's not ego-driven, because that's the way we channel. We channel it to the good. Sometimes we have to discuss with others. Sometimes we have to get advice from others. We have to talk to friends, talk to mentors, because it's easy to slip into what we think is channeling and in fact isn't. What we think is being used for the good, and it's actually not. It's still being driven by the ego. You know, I've shared this to you before, but I'll just quickly share with you again because it's so fascinating. Every time I think about it, wow. This concept of subtle self-interest and how dangerous it could be. In the time of the temple, the Kohen Gadol was the high priest. He was supposed to be the most pious of all people, right? He was the one who went into the Holy of Holies once a year on Yom Kippur. Now you know that the Jewish calendar, in fact this year is a leap year, we had an extra month of Adar, that's why everything's late, right? Pesach was late this year, Shavuot is late. It's actually not late, it was in the right time, just late in the secular calendar, right? No, it's a funny expression, it says, it's very late this year, Pesach. It's actually not, it comes on the 15th of Nisan every single year, it's amazing. Same date every year. Meaning late in the seasons, I get that, okay. So, right, so the reason that Pesach was late this year, to use that expression, is because this year's a leap year, because we added an extra month of Adar. That's why Pesach last year was early, right? So, because it was the end of the cycle. So every 2-3 years we have, why? Because the Torah tells us that we have to have an extra month every few years to calibrate the lunar system and the solar system, so that we work on a lunar month system, but our festivals are in the seasons, so we have to have it synchronized, right? And in times of old, in temple times, it wasn't done like we have today, a proper system. It was done a year-by-year basis, and there was lots of considerations of each year when they would decide, before the end of the cycle, before the month of Adar, whether we need another month. So the Kohen Gadol, who's a tzaddik, who was a great pious person, was not allowed to sit on the committee to decide whether there should be a leap year or not. Why? Listen to this. This is crazy. Because 7 months from now is going to be Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol was very busy in the temple. And part of his very busy ritual schedule on Yom Kippur was going to a mikveh 5 times during Yom Kippur. And in those days, there were no heating systems. So the mikveh was cold, and the Kohen Gadol was sometimes elderly. Right? So we worried that perhaps the self-interest of the Kohen Gadol wanting Yom Kippur to be a little bit earlier in the Northern Hemisphere, season-wise that is, in order that it shouldn't be too cold, in order they shouldn't have to suffer throughout the day with going to the mikveh, and a very, very freezing mikveh, so it's not a good idea. It's conflicted, and because it's conflicted, that's, I tell you, if you look at the Jewish sources, the concept of conflict of interest is taken a lot further than it is in Jewish law, in secular law. We just have to adhere to it, of course, but it's unbelievable, right? So we don't allow him on the committee because of that. Now, I can guarantee you that any Kohen Gadol of any worth that ever would sit on a committee would never even be thinking about this mikveh thing on Yom Kippur. So it's a subconscious thing. It's not. I don't think it's a conscious thing, right? I don't think any Kohen Gadol, a worthy Kohen Gadol, would sit at a committee meeting to see if we should add a month, and think to himself, I don't want this year. It's going to be too cold in the mikveh, right? He would never be so self-centered, but it's that subtle, perhaps, that hidden enemy, that hidden ego, that might just get in the way and sway his opinion, even subconsciously, right? That's how difficult it can be, and that's what we have to be aware of. And that is the bow and arrow part of shooting the distant enemy, the non-obvious enemy. How do you do that? The mystics explain. You've got to dig very deep into yourself. You've got to be very reflective. Dig very, very deep into yourself. That's the pulling the bow. Digging into yourself also means you've got to go right into yourself to discover the part of you that's not ego-driven. To discover, as we've talked about so many times, and we talked about many, many times last series, to discover that actually in our essence, our foundation is not ego. That's where Freud missed it, right? Where our foundation is a lot deeper than the ego. That beyond the ego, as deep as the ego is, and as complicated as the ego is, and as potentially dangerous our ego is, it does not define us. That we have within our neshama something deeper, something a lot more pure, something a lot more holy, that spark, that neshama that's deep down, which is pure and selfless. And if we go pull very, very closely inside, we pull that bow deep, deep inside, that's what That's what Lag BaOmer teaches us. That's one of the lessons of Lag BaOmer. The bow and arrow, where Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was such a great sage, and he taught this stuff. He taught these mystical teachings, and he taught these concepts about how to become more connected to God and less connected to our own ego. That's one of the lessons from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the bow and arrow theory. That you dig very deep into yourself, you find that part of yourself that's not ego-based, and from there you take the strength to make decisions based on what's right, rather than what's based on self-interest. So I thought, and that's how we do channeling as well, because channeling is very important when we do that, to reflect and to dig deeper and to make sure that when we channel a negative emotion into the positive, it actually is positive. That it's not driven by our own self-interest, but it's driven by values and driven by what's right. Okay. Which goes into today's thing, right? So, last week, we talked about jealousy. And when we talked about jealousy, we quoted a passage from the Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, right? Remember that? Kinat ta'ava kavod, which is jealousy, lust, and pursuit of honor that destroys a person, takes a person out of the world. So last week we talked about jealousy. Now when we talk about the next one, which is ta'ava, that's not a hard one to talk about. Obviously, lust in the terms of indulgence and overindulging in pleasure is a bad thing. On the other hand, we can see the channeling fairly obviously there, because wanting is a good thing. Just got to want the right things, right? So obviously that's an important one. But the other one is a quite a complicated one. Pursuit of honor. Now it's easy to see how pursuit of honor is a negative thing and a destructive thing, right? It's arrogant. I mean, people who are always seeking honor. It's interesting, there's another passage in Pirkei Avot that says, it talks about someone who's rodef achara kavod, someone who pursues honor. Right? He's always wanting people to show them honor. So it says, there's an interesting passage, it says, Kol harodef achara kavod, anyone who runs after honor, pursues glory, honor will run away from him. Kol haboreach min hakavod, anyone who runs away from honor will pursue them, right? So humility is, I tell a little story about someone came to a rabbi once, he said, I got a problem with this passage. He says, I'm boreach min hakavod, I'm always running away from honor, but honor never seems to catch up with me. So the rabbi says, I'll tell you why. He says, because when you're running away from honor, you turn around to see if it's running after you. Okay. Now, we know that, of course, in Jewish thinking, we've talked about this many times, of course, not running after honor, not running after glory is such an unbelievably virtuous thing. Humility is considered one of the greatest things that we could be. In 2 weeks' time from this Sunday is Shavuot. Shavuot is the anniversary of the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. The Talmud tells us that why did God choose the mountain of Sinai to be the one to give the Torah? Because it was the lowest mountain, right? In the Midrashic terminology, the Talmud says that the mountains had a dispute, had a debate, which one was going to be the one that God wanted to give it on a mountain, and which one was going to be the one. And this mountain said, I'm the tallest. This one said, I'm the widest. And at the end, I'm worthy for God to give me the Torah. At the end, of course, God gave the Torah on Mount Sinai, the tiny mountain, the small mountain, because of humility, the virtue of humility. And we are taught that the only way to really achieve Torah connection, the only way to really absorb Torah knowledge in its really authentic form is through humility. At the end of the Amidah that we say during our prayers, there's an expression that we ask God for humility, and then right away we ask God for success in acquiring Torah, Jewish wisdom, because a prerequisite to true wisdom is humility, and so on and so forth. However, having said that, everything has a purpose. So here's the question. Where's the pursuit of honor? Where's the channeling there? How do we understand the channeling in that concept, right? Now it's interesting, just to share with you a Maharal, the Maharal of Prague. I've mentioned it before, great philosopher, one of the great Jewish thinkers, 400 years ago. Says about this Mishnah, and this just shows us that particularly this passage is a passage where we must understand that there must be channeling. So we've talked about desire, we've talked about jealousy. Why? Because as I mentioned before, the Maharal says that these three things, jealousy, lust, and pursuit of honor, is actually the very essential makeup of every human being. This is what a human being is. And he says it in an interesting way, with an interesting perspective. He says the person is made up of three parts. We have what he calls the guf, which is the body, and what it takes for the body to survive. The ruach, which he terms as the energy, the vibrancy, which is where our emotional makeup is sort of expressed. And then nefesh, our soul, which he explains to mean, sometimes the terminology is used differently in different places, but he explains it to mean the perspective, right? Mindset. So he says that's what a human being is. We have basic human instincts that cause us to survive bodily, in a physical sense. We have the vibrancy of our personality, which we use our emotional setup in order to express ourselves in an emotional way, in order for our personality to be expressed and to be manifested. And then we have the way we look at the world. That's particularly unique to humans, our mindset, our attitudes, the way we perceive things, our perspectives. So he says these three things live on those three layers. Ta'ava, he says lust, desire, that's just a human instinct. That's an impulsive human instinct. Kids from a very, very young age, it's an amazing thing. He doesn't say this, but it's an amazing thing. One of the first things kids do is eat. Right? They look for food. Suck. Right? What do kids do as they start to grow? What do they do with everything, which is a nightmare if you have small things in the floor? They put it in their mouth, right? Because that's what it is. They want to eat, right? That's the first instinct before even any emotion is developed, before mindset's developed for sure. It's ta'ava, the desire just to survive, which comes from pursuing pleasure and pursuing things that we like and so on and so forth. Jealousy is already more of an emotion that lives on the level of personality, right? So ta'ava is not so much a personality, ta'ava is an emotion also, wanting things and pursuing pleasure. Obviously it's an emotional attachment, it's a response to things on the outside, but it's more sort of basic survival instinct, whereas kina, jealousy, is more personality. That's what personality is, right? Kavod is pursuit of honor. What is that? That's mindset. For some people, it's a delusional mindset. But right? When people sort of self-grandiose and always looking for people to put them on a pedestal and so on and so forth. But in whatever form it comes, it's coming from a mindset. It's coming from an attitude. It's not an emotion. Jealousy is like an emotion. It's like I feel anger, I feel vengeance, I feel I want something, right? From that someone else has, I feel angry, whatever the case is. Pursuing honor is more about how I perceive myself in a way. Most times erroneously, right? Or how I perceive my definition, or how important it is for me to be perceived in a particular way, right? So that's always asking for pursuing honor. Yeah? So that's a mindset thing. Now why did I bring that in? Because being that he explains that these three things is really the three essential layers of what it means to be human, that just emphasizes this idea that they must be able to be used for the positive. They're there for a purpose. If that's the way God designed the human being at the very essence of our human existence, that means that we have to be able to use all three things in a positive way. And not only we have to be able to use it in a positive way, it's essential. It's an essential part of who we are. Like we explained last week, jealousy is an essential part of the human experience. Because if we didn't have jealousy, we wouldn't want to upgrade. We wouldn't want to emulate. We wouldn't model on other people. That's a healthy competition. Or like we said last week, Kinat Sofrim Tarbeh Chochmah. The Talmud says that jealousy among scholars increases wisdom, and so on and so forth. In a healthy way, a non-competitive way, without putting other people down, and so on. But it's essential. If you're missing, completely eradicated the concept of jealousy, positive and negative, that will stunt growth. That's not a good thing, right? So therefore the same thing must be with the concept of kavod, pursuing glory. So what does that mean? How does that work in the positive? Right? And I think the way it works in the positive is the following way. It centers around the concept of respect and dignity. What do I mean by that? Here we are. When we talk about humility, and we've talked about this many times, right? Humility doesn't mean I devalue myself. That's not humility, right? That's insecurity, not humility. Right? Humility means that I don't feel myself superior to others. Humility means that I make room for others. Humility means I value what others have that I don't have and I can learn from them. Humility means that I don't define myself by the things that I was able to achieve or my talents or the things that I might be better than other people at and so on. But humility also means, and must come from, and must include a very, very deep and important understanding of my own intrinsic value. All right? We've talked about this many times. Which, by the way, when a person is truly humble, which means truly humble in the good sense, which means they understand their intrinsic value, they understand their intrinsic worth, it comes together with, and often it comes because of, understanding the intrinsic value and the dignity of other people as well. You understand? It must come together. This is very, very important, because if I understand my value but I devalue others, that means I haven't really understood my value. Because I'm talking myself into it that I'm more valuable than other people. That means I haven't understood my true value. True value means understand, as we've talked about many times, understand my intrinsic value. What's my intrinsic value? The spark that at the very essence of who I am, the godliness, the holiness, the purity, that is the essence and foundation of my identity. That spark everyone has. That spark doesn't make me superior to other people because you have it as much as I have it. You have a different way of expressing it than I have a different way of expressing it. You have a different mission than I have a mission. We all have different missions, we all have different journeys, we all have different ways of applying it. But at the very core essence, we've all got that godly spark. We've all got that neshama. We've all got that godly imprint. As the ethics of the Father tells us that every single human being is created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. Which is why in the Talmud we find that one of the most important things in human observance, human practice, is the respect for the dignity of the human being. And that's why the Talmud says that when you humiliate someone else, embarrassing someone else, particularly in public, is tantamount to murder. That's what the Talmud says. It's like murder. Why? Because when you upset with someone, or you do something, or you're unkind to someone, that's one thing. But when you humiliate them, what you're doing is you are compromising and attacking the very essence of their dignity. And that's undermining who they are. So, understanding the true value of a human being means that I'm very protective of their dignity. I'm very protective of how I talk to them. I'm very careful not to embarrass them. Why? Because I've come to the understanding of what it means to appreciate the essence of what it means to be human. I understand the godly imprint of the human body. I understand the godly essence of the human soul. Right? And it goes together. If I understand it with other people, I understand it with myself. If I understand it with myself, I understand it with other people. Otherwise, I'm understanding the wrong thing. Because when we talk about understanding the true value of the human being, that is that spark, that is that essence that I share with the rest of everyone else. Right? Which therefore also means that just like I have to be protective, and just like I have to value and respect and cherish the dignity of everyone, of every human being, I also have to cherish the dignity of myself. That's very different than looking for glory, looking for honor. But it does mean self-respect. It does mean being dignified. It does mean acting in a way which brings dignity to my existence and to my observance and to my practice. Right? Because devaluing myself or behaving in an undignified way, right? In other words, being humble doesn't mean to act like a shmata, to use the Yiddish term, right? Or to downgrade myself all the time, or to despise myself, or to act in a way which is undignified. Why? Because I've misunderstood, therefore, the dignity of what it means to be human. I've understood the essence of what it means to be human, which will inevitably mean I'll misunderstand with other people as well, and it'll bring to disrespecting others as well. Right? That is the positive expression of kavod. Right? When God gave the Torah, to go back to the Shavuot model, right? And He gave it on Mount Sinai, which was the lowest mountain because of humility. I've told you this before, but He gave it on a mountain. Because humility is not lack of strength. He didn't give it in a valley. Commentaries all ask the question. He was looking for humility. Why not a hole in the ground? Right? Should have called to us from the hole in the ground and say, this is where the Torah comes from deep down in the earth. No. Because God said you have to be a mountain. A mountain is a symbol of strength, but you have to be a humble mountain. Right? Which therefore means, and this is the complicated part, therefore means that the difference between the dignity of a human being in terms of looking for negative honor as opposed to being self-respecting and dignified and valuing our intrinsic value is that the one brings me to define myself by externalities. The one brings me to seek external approval from others. The other one, the positive one, is like we've talked always about, it's more about inside out, more about understanding my intrinsic value, bringing to a life of strength, a life of values, a life of purpose. Very, very different, but still inner strength and inner respect as well. Is that clear? Yeah? Let me just explain this a little bit by using one of the teachings of Rabbi Shimon. I said I'd use it today because it's Lag BaOmer. So let me share with you another teaching from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It's also quoted in Ethics of the Father. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said the following. He talks about 3 crowns. Right? 3 crowns. Shloshak Tarim. He said there's 3 crowns. They are the crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, the crown of sovereignty, of kingship, right? We'll take the last sentence in a minute. Those are the 3 crowns. By the way, so we talk about in a global community sense, we say the crown of priesthood belonged to Aharon HaKohen, Aaron and his children. They're the Kohanim, and it's part of the jewel of the Jewish nation to have Kohanim, but it's not necessarily for everyone. The crown of sovereignty belonged to King David and his descendants. Ultimately, Mashiach will be a descendant of King David as well. The crown of Torah, the Talmud tells us elsewhere, is given to everyone. There's no monopoly on that. That's for everyone, right? Okay, so the Rosh Shimon says there's 3 crowns. Now, spiritually speaking, these 3 crowns apply to everyone, but in practice, the crown of Torah is everyone. But then he ends off this passage with a very strange thing, and he says, the Keter Shem Tov, the crown of a good reputation, surpasses them all, is better than all of them. Right? So first of all, why is that? And second of all, the maths is wrong. So, how many crowns are there at the end? Right? 4. So all the commentaries ask, why does he start off by saying there 3? It's like a very Jewish way of saying things, right? 3 crowns. But you should know that the crown of good name surpasses them all. Right? So he should have started by saying there's 4 crowns. And by the way, the most important one is reputation. And finally, why is reputation more important than anything else? Isn't it better to be a good person? Isn't it better to be a person of values? Reputation is a good reputation is a nice thing to have, but is it the most important thing? And what happens if you're not popular? Sometimes we're not on a popularity test. Sometimes we're going to do what's right, not what's popular. Right? Is good reputation everything? Not necessarily, but the depth of this is the following. Good reputation is important. Why is it important, first of all? Because it's good honor. What does good reputation mean? Good reputation means I'm a model. I'm an example of good behavior. That's what good reputation means. Good reputation means a person who inspires other people, and that's important, it's critical. Because part of that dignity, part of good honor that we're supposed to pursue is being a person that people look up to in a good sense. And we all have to be like that. We all have to be people that others can learn from. One of the most important things the Talmud tells us is that it's not good enough just to be a good person. You have to make goodness attractive. We have a responsibility to make morality attractive. Right? So don't say I'm going to be incredibly humble, so I'm going to walk around and let everyone think I'm an absolute garbage person, but really I'm not. I don't care what other people think of me. No, you need to care what other people think of you in a good sense. And the Ethics of the Father says other places that what pleases other people pleases God. Now it's a very, very dangerous statement, but we have to understand what it means. We're not into people pleasing. We're into doing the right thing, but we have to do the right thing in a way where it becomes attractive to others. Because that is important. It is important for people to see us as a good example, for people to see us as a role model, for people to see each and every one of us as someone who can inspire others to do good. That's what society does. We help each other, we support each other. So reputation and coming across, as it says in many places, there's a verse which says, "V'asisa hayashar v'atov," you should do what's right and what's good in the eyes of God and people. Right? So wherever possible, it's not just good enough to say, look, I did the right thing, I don't care what people think. No. Make sure people know about you did the right thing. Because it's important for people to be inspired by good living, by moral living. People shouldn't suspect you of doing the wrong thing. People shouldn't think you're not a good person, therefore don't want to learn from you. Part of self-respect is behaving in a respectable way that people actually can learn and be inspired from the way you are. However, says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that is not an end in itself. He says, really, there are 3 crowns. There are 3 things that make you into a good person. And one of the ways to explain it is as follows. Number 1 is the crown of Torah, knowledge, education, like we spoke about before. You have to learn, you have to grow, people have to educate themselves. Then there's the crown of Kahuna. Kahuna means, as the commentaries explain how it applies to everyone, is the idea of Kahuna is holy, the idea of sanctity, the idea of giving meaning, purpose, sanctity, holiness to what we do in life. And finally, the idea of Malchut, kingship. What does that refer to? It refers to self-control. One has to be a king over themselves. So in fact, there are 3 crowns. There are 3 crowns, only 3 crowns. However, when you can take those 3 crowns and behave in such a way where your reputation is based on those 3 crowns, in other words, your reputation is like a 4th crown, but it's a crown sitting and as a result of, as an extension of your values. It's an extension of your morality. It's an extension of your good character. It's an extension of your good living. Then that takes you to a whole new height. In other words, to be a good person, you need 3 crowns. You need to be knowledgeable, you need to be purposeful, and you need to be a person of self-control. Torah, Kahuna, Malchut, sovereignty. However, don't stop there. Because those 3 crowns will be incredibly upgraded. That's what it means. The Keter Shem Tov, the crown of good reputation, the Hebrew word for it is not surmounts them all. If you look at the real Hebrew of the Pirkei Avot, it says, Ole al gabehen, climbs on top of them. Which always is understood as, is better than all of them. But it doesn't actually mean that. Ole al gabehen means it climbs on top of those values. If your reputation is a reputation of those 3 crowns, that's true living. Then you're an inspiration to other people. Then your reputation is part of morality. Then your reputation is part of strength. It's a reputation, it's an honor, it's a dignity that comes from humility. It comes from a life of meaning, it comes from living a purpose, not a life of showness, not a life of trying to emulate other people, not a life of popularity and people pleasing. It's a life of strength, it's a life coming from deep down within our soul that is giving you and inspiring you to live a life of purpose, which is then being displayed and being publicized to other people. This is a hard thing, even, I've shared this with you before, but even in the laws of giving charity, there's a big debate about this, which is difficult, right? Because in Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam, it says one of the greatest ways to give charity is anonymously. And we have stories in Jewish history about shtetls, misers, that they died, and all of a sudden, people found out that actually they were the greatest philanthropic people, just no one ever knew about it, everyone always talked badly about them, right? And they ended up being great people. Why did they choose to do that? Because they wanted to be humble. Okay, it has a place. However, there's one of the famous halachic authorities, the Rashba says that be careful about that. Because the flip side to that is mitzvah lefarsem or say mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to publicize good deeds, to be an inspiration to other people. The problem there is the balance. The problem is that, particularly with philanthropy, is that how do I do it in a way where I publicize it so people can learn, but I'm not doing it for self-honor? That's difficult, right? I think I told you the story once about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Always used to talk about this, about people giving. People should give and they should publicize the giving. He wanted people to learn from other people, especially in our time. So one time a person came to him and said, Rabbi, I've given $500,000 to some federation or some Jewish cause in order to, but I don't want to give it. I want to give it, I'm committed to it, but I don't want to do it in a way where it's public because I like giving anonymously. So the Rebbe said, I've got a perfect solution for you. Give $500,000 anonymously and $500,000 in publicized. So you'll have both. You have both strengths. You'll have an anonymous donor, plus people will learn from you, right? So it's hard, as I said before. We gotta check our own ego. We can't always get it right. Okay, so sometimes if a person gets a plaque on the wall, okay, it's fine, doesn't matter. But other people learn from them. As long as we're not doing it only for that, as long as we're doing it for the right reasons, also we have to always try and do it for the right reasons. But there is this concept of other people of living a life of values and living a life of goodness and the 3 crowns and having that self-respect to say, no, I'm not going to behave in a way where it appears that I'm not behaving in a dignified way. It appears I'm not behaving in a respectful way. I need to behave in a way where people see my dignity, people see my value, because they can learn from it. Right? But what is one of the ways that I keep that in check? What is one of the ways that I make sure that the pursuit of honor in this good sense, to have a good reputation based on values, or to have a dignity that I have self-respect and strength, and I'm humble, but I'm the mountain of Sinai, how do I make sure that remains and it doesn't derail into just a self-serving pursuit of honor? So there's another passage in Pirkei Avot that gives us the answer, I think. And it says, who is mechubad, who is truly honorable? Someone who honors other people. In other words, if we keep respecting others, that keeps us in check to remind ourselves why we might sometimes also publicize or seek that good reputation of other people seeing that we're doing good things. Why? Because if you look at the language, right? If you look at the language, it says, Eizehu mechubad, who is honorable? It says about what? Someone who honors other people, but the term for people it uses there is briot. It says, hamechabed et habriot, one who honors other briot. The word in Hebrew for briot means creations. And that's a very funny term to term people. Creations. Not creations, they're people, right? I mean, in context, it's talking about honoring other people. That who is truly honorable, he who honors other people. So why does it use the term briot, creation? It's a very funny terminology to use in referring to people. Right? And one of the answers is that when you're giving people true respect, when you respect them for being a creation, being God's creation. That's how you respect them. In other words, when you only respect people because they have a lot, or they're very smart, or they're very talented, that's why you respect them. But a simple person who doesn't seem to have any of these things, you don't have the time of day for them, that's not respect. If I respect other briot, which means if I respect people not because they're smart, not because they have a lot, not because they're talented, not because they're clever, not because they're good, because they're briot, because they have a soul, because they're created by God, because they have a godly imprint, that's how I become an honorable person. That's how I make sure that when I seek a life of dignity and self-respect, it's based on the same principle. It's not based on externalities, it's not based on grandiose, erroneous, delusional honor-seeking, but it's based on the inside, based on the soul, based on wanting people to be inspired by the goodness that I act upon, based on my soul, based on what's coming from deep down inside of me, and not from grandiose and imagery that's coming from the outside. That's the secret. So the way to make sure that we stay in check. So pursuit of honor can be channeled. Dignity, self-respect, inspiring others, making sure people are aware of the good things that we do so they can learn from us and be inspired. But the way that we make sure that we keep that in a humble check, that we're a mountain but a humble mountain, and we don't derail and sort of start looking for things that don't belong to us, that just for self-interest, is by making the best way to do that is to making sure that we respect other people for who they are. When we respect people for who they are, we never forget the true essence and the true meaning and the true strength and honor of what every human being has, which is that inside soul and not the externalities. In the coming weeks, we're going to continue on. We're going to talk about things like worry and fear and guilt and all these wonderful things. And have a good week.